Thank you, Ms. Missler. Now we'll hear from the LAO, Mr. Golazewski.
Thanks. Paul Golazewski with the LAO. We have a handout that should be in front of you from which I'll be speaking today. There'll be 3 areas that I'll cover in my presentation. First, I'll talk a little bit about how our community college tuition and fees and other costs compare with other states. Next, I'll talk about what other states are doing in terms of free community college tuition programs. And finally, I'll close with some questions for you to consider as you think about this issue. So as Mr. Troy mentioned, the per unit charge in California is $46, and there's also some other fees that community college students can be required to pay, such as health services fee. So for a full-time student in 13-14, the average across the system per year was about $1,238 in tuition and fees. And if you turn to page 2 of the handout, we have a figure that shows how we compare to the rest of the country. As you heard earlier, we are the lowest. You can see at the very bottom of the figure is California, around $1,200, as I mentioned. Most states' tuition and fees, many states are 2 to 3 times that amount, or even 4 or 5 times the amount. So we do rank quite low in terms of our tuition and fee levels. If you go to the 3rd page of the handout, I'll talk about how we compare in terms of other costs that Senator Allen had brought up and Mr. Troy. Besides tuition, students also incur costs for housing, food, books and supplies, transportation. And these costs can vary depending on a student's living situation. If they're living at home or if they're renting an apartment, the costs will be quite different. For students living off campus with family in 13-14, the average across the system was about $7,300. And in contrast, for students living off campus but not with their families, it was more than twice that amount. It was a little over $1,800, so quite a big difference depending on the student's living situation. Now, slightly more students live off campus with family than without. It's about 57% live with their families, about 42% don't live with their families, and only a very, very small number live on campus, less than 1%. So if you turn to page 4 of the handout, you can see this chart is for students living off campus not with their families. And you can see California actually ranks quite high in terms of costs here. And probably the biggest factor contributing to this is housing costs in California are relatively high compared to the rest of the country. So that's probably why we rank near the top there. On page 5, I'll talk a little bit about a concept that's called net price that the federal government calculates. And as you've heard in the previous presentations, there's a lot of financial aid available for students, a lot of grant aid, Pell Grants, Cal Grants, Board of Governor fee waivers. So what the average net price is trying to calculate is the total cost of attendance for a student, which includes tuition, fees, housing, all of the things that I talked about on the previous slide, and then subtracting the average grant award. So this is just for students who get grant financial aid, what's the average amount, and then coming up with what's called a net price. That net price in California for community college students is about $7,300, almost $7,400 in 13-14, and the national median was about $7,000, so it's a little bit higher, and we have a chart on page 6 that shows where we rank slightly above.
So the chart from the page before does not include any grants.
Correct. Yeah, the previous chart is if you're a full pay, if you're not receiving any grants. This chart is if you're receiving grant aid, what the average is. It's an average, so it could be different.
Okay. Well, through the chair, So on this next chart, the idea being that we had more grant aid typically than the typical state. Is that what drops us? So that's what drops us from 5th or 6th down to.
It can also vary depending on how many students are living, because this is a blended average of living off campus with family and off campus without family. So states could also differ in terms of that mix. But yes, part of the reason would be also because of the differences in grant aid across the states.
Okay. Thank you.
So now I'll turn to the second part of my presentation, which will talk about what other states are doing in terms of community college tuition and free tuition programs. There have been various proposals put forth in recent years, as you've probably heard. A couple of general points about these proposals. Most of them are not outright eliminating tuition. Most of them do have some sort of eligibility criteria for students to qualify to not pay tuition. Typically, there's a minimum grade point average, for example. The proposals that have been put forth also can vary in terms of other features. For instance, how long they would cover tuition. In many cases, it's 2 years, but in some cases, it's longer. They vary a little bit in terms of what they pay for. Most of them are focused strictly on tuition, but there are some that also provide some funding for other attendance costs that we've been talking about. And the last point on page 7, I would highlight, many of the proposals are structured such that they provide the last dollar. So that's after all other federal aid, federal or state aid is taken into account. If you have any tuition costs left, then the program would pay for that. On page 8, we have a figure. The 2 states that have so far enacted broad-based tuition-free community college programs are Tennessee and Oregon. And there's a figure there that shows some of the features. They're both relatively new programs. As you can see, Tennessee enrolled the first cohort just in fall 2015. Oregon will be starting in this fall. It hasn't even started yet. They differ a little bit in terms of grade point average. Tennessee's is a 2.0, Oregon's is a 2.5. On both programs, you have to enroll fairly quickly after your high school graduation. It's not for older students necessarily. They differ a little bit in terms of how many units you need to take. Tennessee, you have to take 12 units, which is essentially considered full-time. Oregon allows part-time enrollment as well. The figure here goes through a lot of the differences. I'll just highlight 2 more. In terms of what the programs pay for, Tennessee's is strictly just tuition. However, Oregon's, if you already have your tuition paid for through another program, Pell Grants or another state program that they might have, then you also could receive a stipend of $1,000 that could pay for your other costs for housing or food or things like that. So that's a key difference between the 2. And Tennessee's is structured, I guess, similar to an entitlement program where if you qualify, then you can receive it, whereas Oregon has put a funding cap of $10 million on it. And if they were to exceed that amount, then they would have to ration the awards, although they project that they'll be able to fund all the qualified students right now. Page 9 has some initial data from Tennessee, just from the first year of students. The state estimates that about 80% of high school graduates applied for the program and about 28% enrolled, and they received an average award of about $1,000. Enrollment did increase a bit at community colleges in Tennessee with this program. It went up 23%. However, at the same time, enrollment at their 4-year institutions went down 7%. So there could have been some students who otherwise would have gone to a 4-year, went to their community college. The net change was a 10% increase in enrollment nonetheless. State officials are still conducting other research to understand some of these trends. Page 10 is a little bit of information on the federal proposal that you might have heard about that the president has proposed. It would eliminate tuition for 2 years for students with a 2.5. The federal government would pick up 3/4 of the cost of the program, and states would have to pay the remainder. However, states that already were paying more would have smaller contributions. There have been 2 bills introduced in Congress, but they're pending at the moment, and they're modeled after the president's proposal. Page 11, we have some information. There's also been some local programs. There's some information about a program that the city of Chicago has started to waive tuition, as well as here in California. You've probably heard of the Long Beach Promise. It's quite a notable program that waives tuition for 1. I think they're expanding it to 2 semesters for local high school students at their community college. And lastly, I'll close with some questions for you to consider on pages 12 and 13 of the handout. The first has to do with how a program to waive tuition for students here in California on a broad basis would affect access. Which types of students would this benefit? how much would it benefit? How would it help them? For instance, would they work fewer hours as a result of this program? Would they be able to borrow less money? Or would it just reduce the amount that their parents are spending? There would be some questions for you to consider exactly how this would help students. How the program might affect enrollment at four-year institutions. As I mentioned earlier, there was a decrease in Tennessee at four-year institutions. As well as if there's other, as you've heard about from previous panelists, other significant financial barriers to access besides tuition, such as living expenses. And we have some other points here. I won't go through every one in terms of the program design, what the eligibility criteria should be, how that should relate to the existing Board of Governors fee waiver program, Cal Grants, how it would all be coordinated, how long the program would pay for tuition and fees, and whether or not the program would be structured as an entitlement program or would it be capped at a funding level like Oregon did. And as Mr. Troy mentioned earlier, an important point to consider is how the student would pay for the program's costs. Would you have to redirect from other community college programs? What implications would that have for those programs? We think that those are some of the key issues for you to consider.
Great, thank you, Mr. Baptiste. Thank all three of you. That was sort of great presentations. At this point, I'm going to see if my colleagues have any questions or comments.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Morlock.
Let me start with Mr. Troy. Can I go to page 2 of your presentation and just ask some questions? Because page 2 is sort of like in the beginning. You know, so you're giving some history, and I'd kind of like you to just fill it out a little bit. So in the beginning, how many community colleges did we have in 1910?
That was our first. The community colleges proliferated somewhat later in the mid-century. They're really an outgrowth of our K-12 districts, and so it wasn't until the late '60s that the community colleges existed as their own entity with their own board of governors and all that. So in some ways, the true origin of the community colleges you can trace back to the late '60s as an independent entity, but they had been around a long time providing free access to for higher education needs prior to that, but again, as an outgrowth of K-12.
So my folks had to move in the early '60s because our dairy was sold so they could put in a housing tract. And so we moved to a few miles away, but next to another dairy. And then that dairy was sold, and it is now Cypress College, which is a community college. So when I was a youngster, that's where we played ditchum and rode our bikes and played sports and did everything.
Well,
so
your access would have been very good if you had stayed.
it was outstanding. It was a great thing. But so I wanted to know, how the progression was, because in the beginning, what percentage of the state's budget was community colleges?
Oh, my history unfortunately does not go back that far, and we'd probably have to find some dusty archives to get at that.
I'm an accountant, so that kind of history, if someone has it, it'd be kind of fun to see how things have morphed over.
Well, I think there are some
decades.
resources I can find for you, and I'd be happy to provide it to you and committee staff.
Okay. Now, page 13. So I'm looking at your pie chart. So if I were to assume that you didn't charge fees still, there would be no chart at all, right?
Correct.
So then this number of at least receiving hard cash from tuition is 407 million approximately. Was that the goal, to get a 407 million? So you knew you had to raise the fee to $46 because...
Yeah, it's always part of the budget discussions, and generally fees increase in hard times in the state budget. So to give you an example, in the 11-12 years, in 2011-12 year was a very bad year for the state budget, and we were enacting very significant cuts to the colleges and, of course, across all of entities of state government. And the colleges were assigned at the time of the initial January proposal reductions of about $400 million. So what the state did was they waived the fees from that point from $26 to $36, thinking, well, that will bring in more fee revenue that will help mitigate those cuts. So that's the kind of logic that comes into play. It's generally a way to say, well, let's get some additional fee revenues from students who can afford to pay, and that will support the system and help mitigate those budget cuts.
So on page 15, we then have the Cal grants, which are funded by the state, correct?
Yes, correct.
So then, if we had no fees, then you wouldn't have Cal Grant A or B, is that correct?
Not necessarily the case. Cal Grants do take into account other forms of assistance for students. And again, Cal Grants are not funded in the community college budget. Those are benefits directly to students who receive them. And I would note that while community colleges have about 2/3 of the public higher education enrollment in California, we receive only about 6% of the Cal Grant dollars. So that's part of the reason why we're looking to the Cal Grant program to help support our students' cost of attendance.
Okay, so that's where I'm missing the big picture. When we talk about the UC system, we kind of get their revenues, and it's kind of broken up. And so California's contribution to the UC system is maybe, what, 23% of the revenues, and they have tuition and other revenues. And so it's not like California dominates the UC system, but it's a critical component. But for the community colleges, how does it work? You're raising fees, so you have to raise grants. I'm just wondering, if there's a study that shows, okay, if you didn't charge, then you wouldn't have to give grants, and then how would the funding to run the campuses, what would that look like? And is there an analysis?
Well, essentially, this is it's not a campus level issue. It's a state funding level issue because of the interaction with Proposition 98. So it's a somewhat different calculation. Where at UC they have institutional aid, for example, so the fee revenues come in and they assess that students in some cases meet certain criteria, and they can put the fees back into a student support. So that's the kind of calculation that they make there. But our judgments are made at the state level here. We're looking at broad terms of dollars for Prop 98. We fund certain amounts of access to the system, and those decisions are made in the budget. And we're looking at the pool of resources available to fund that. That includes Prop 98, and that includes fee revenues.
So we've got a multi-dimensional chess game going on here. Where
Absolutely.
Got to play with other dynamics. Okay. Then on page 18, and it was covered by legislative analysts as well, is sort of like, what is the role of parents? Now, I have Orange Coast College in my district, and that's where 2 of my kids went for a little while. So I'm a beneficiary there, but they lived at home. And is there like a residence requirement? In other words, my kids went to OCC because they started with their crew team, but can they go to any community college?
Any community college within the state, we have what we call free flow in the state. So as long as you're a California resident, you have the same right to attend any community college in the state as anyone else.
And so if I wanted to get rid of my kids, I'd have sent them to Humboldt County and gone to school there.
Yeah, you may want to talk to that's a family discussion.
Yeah, that's why we have these. That's why we have these housing costs, because you would kind of assume that, hey, if it's so convenient, it's a community college, you'd be going right.
Yeah, that's right. But note that since we charge the same per resident fee for student, there's no difference between whether you live in that community or you've gone across the state to a different college. That's the fees implications are the same.
Then okay, I've already discussed the one on page 19. Then just a couple quick questions for Ms. Misler.
Before we get to that, what I want to do is move to another senator. Will come back to you for other questions for other people, just so people all get a chance. Senator Allen, do you have questions?
Yeah, I wanted to, so we've alluded to this conversation that's going on at the federal level. If we were to, to implement the president's vision, how would our system be impacted? So, and is the fact that we've got such low fees vis-a-vis the other states actually would that be a disadvantage within the context of a federal tuition-free college plan?
I don't think that is the intent of the president. I
I'm
think,
sure it's not.
yeah, I think I certainly understand the question. Could we be penalized for already having low fees? So does that mean we would get less federal support to
Right.
eliminate or reduce those fees? That question is very clear. I think what the president's plan is intended to do is take a look at average rates and provide funds based on that rate. So the fact that we have low fees means that we would get more funds, for example, that we could use for other supports services for the students. So I don't think the president's intent is to penalize us for our current generosity.
So, okay, and do we
I
have,
think we would get a certain award calculated by some average state rate, and then therefore, since our fees were low, it would be easier for us to reduce those fees, to eliminate those fees rather, and then we could use those other dollars for other programs.
but are
in
there
colleges.
active conversations going on with the White House or the Department of Education or our delegation in Congress to make sure that, that California would be protected in case of such an implementation?
Yes, our office is certainly in contact with Washington. In fact, we have a delegation going next week in order to make our case.
Okay. The other thing is, Paul brought up the California Promise, the Long Beach program, and I had a good time reading through this report on the Long Beach Seamless Education Partnership, and I just wanted to get a sense. It's being brought up as a really cool kind of local model that really brought together all the different sectors, K-12 and Long Beach, the Cal State system and the community college, et cetera. We don't seem to have that kind of articulation typically, and it's one of the sources of frustration I know for all of us. Can any of you speak to, what do you extrapolate from the Long Beach model? Do you think there are serious opportunities for scaling? Is that on the table as a proposal or as an initiative? Does it just kind of sit out there as a cool local model, or should we be trying to go get all of our communities to do something similar? Is there a statewide plan? I'd love to get a sense of your lessons learned from Long Beach.
Sure. The Long Beach Promise program actually was one of the recipients of the Governor's Innovation Awards program, which you might remember from 2 years ago, where there was a program to reward innovative practices around the state. And the idea was to replicate those promising practices across the state. So it was one of the recipients of that award. In terms of the status of how that model is being replicated across the state, I'm not sure. I could look into it and get back to you. My understanding is it did sort of start at the local level many, many years ago. The tuition waivers, they're funded through foundation money is how they actually fund it. So that might be one challenge for other communities to replicate it is in terms of they have the revenue available. I'm not sure exactly how the program generated the revenue in the beginning to fund it. But it generally has been, as I mentioned, it was given one of the awards. It has been sort of viewed as a very promising program. And there's a lot more to it than just waiving the tuition for community college students. There's also a guarantee for admission to CSU Long Beach.
Right.
There's outreach in K-12, bringing elementary and middle school students onto the campus at an early age, collaboration with K-12. But I could look into a little bit more and get back to you in terms of whether or not it's been expanded anywhere else.
Yeah, I'd appreciate it. I mean, it's sometimes we set up these programs and it's kind of, unless they're really poorly executed, it's kind of obvious that they're going to be good. But then the question is, well, what's the point of setting up the pilot if it's just going to prove, it's going to be great for those young people in that one particular community, but if it just proves something that we already knew without any kind of attempt towards scaling, maybe we're losing a real opportunity there. So I would really, really appreciate that. And Mr. Troy, if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think your question hits on a lot of issues we could talk about. I think we have about 10 or 12 colleges in the state that are doing some form of the Promise program, relatively similar to Long Beach, and of course they all have their different puts and calls and criteria on it. But I do want to emphasize that I think one point you're making that's really important here is that to a large extent, a lot of this is really in terms of how are you packaging and articulating a program, right? What are your linkages to the high school? How are you ensuring that those students are well prepared and seamlessly transition from high school to college to the four-year institutions? And I think, Eli, Oakley, and Long Beach and some other colleges that are implementing programs like this would tell you that to some extent the fees are only part of the package, right? That's not the only thing that's helpful. It's those relationships with the high school. Long Beach is at a somewhat at an advantage relative to many of our districts because they have perfect linkage with their high schools in terms of service area. They're perfectly linked, so that makes it very easy to coordinate with a one community college district to one high school district. A lot of our college districts link with 10, 12, 15 high schools. That can be quite a much bigger challenge than what they have. But we have been working in the past few years to increase articulation in a number of ways. Our linkages with the CSU are very strong through the SB 1440 degrees. We have $10 million in this year's budget for basic skills linkages with between the high schools, community colleges, and the CSU campuses. So there's definitely an acknowledgement that the points you raise are very important, and we're trying to work toward that.
Okay. My final question is, I was just at a Cash for College seminar in my own district just this last weekend and spoke to the students. And, FAFSA is not too complicated, but it's kind of complicated, and it does end up being a barrier for kids, for students, families, particularly those who, aren't first generation college going. I see the application requirements. I understand, obviously the most significant barrier to entry for one of these fee waivers is that your family's too wealthy. But are you finding that there are other barriers to entry other barriers for eligibility beyond these income-based eligibility requirements that end up that are either explicit or real because of the way that these fee waivers are applied for or implemented?
Yeah, I think probably the two key areas are, one, just information and knowledge. I think there were a lot of students, or potential students out there who don't realize what forms of aid are available to them, or they believe for some reason that they're going to have to pay the full price tag of going to college. They're not aware that we have Cal Grants and the BOG fee waivers and programs like that. So I think getting that information out to them is very important. In terms of the FAFSA,
largely?
At the high schools are students who have completed high school and are not attending school at all. That's a big issue as well. I think there can be language barriers in terms of communicating those issues to them as well. But certainly the FAFSA is complicated. It can be intimidating for some students if you don't live with your parents and you have to track down your parental information. That can be daunting. Maybe you don't have a good relationship with your parents and you don't want to contact them and get that information from. And I think for a lot of our students, that's a big issue.
That's an interesting issue. I wonder if there's something we can do at the state, because that I know that was an issue for some friends of mine even when they were applying.
Yeah, we do have what we call a short form application in the community colleges for the fee waivers at least. So not everyone has to fill out a FAFSA in order to receive a BOG fee waiver, but that doesn't address some of the larger issues you're talking about.
Thank you, Senator Allen. We'll move back to Senator Morlock now for a couple more questions, and the chair will have a couple questions.
Ms. Missler, on the same subject, filling out a fee waiver, how many employees does the community college districts, how much do they have to employ just to go through the forms and the process?
So, well, for the California Student Aid Commission, we have, we process the FAFSAs and the California DREAM applications to determine Cal Grant eligibility and some of the other programs. I think some of the community colleges there are some campuses who use the FAFSA to determine BOG fee waiver eligibility. In addition to that, there's a supplemental application that's used, but in terms of the number of employees that it takes,
Yeah, I don't know the number of employees offhand, but I know that resources at our financial aid offices can be a challenge, particularly since there's such a rush of them at the same time. You can imagine if you have a line around the corner, you might get discouraged if a community college doesn't have enough staff to address your needs and answer your questions. So staffing is certainly a concern.
So then if we had no tuition, then you wouldn't have to give the fee waivers
That's
or no
true.
fees, and then you kind of have an
You'd
administrative
handle that
process.
issue, right? And then we would tell you that we don't have enough
And my last question,
enrollment counselors.
and I'll try with Ms. Missler again. And by the way, I love your first name. If I had more
Thank you.
daughters, I think one of them would have been named Catalina. So you have 2 years of education at a community college, and then you transfer to a 4-year. How do we maintain quality control? How does the 4-year institution guarantee or come to the conclusion that the 2 years that were performed at the community college met certain standards, that the instructors were the right level, the curriculum was appropriate, et cetera? How do we make sure we're not disadvantaging anyone? Because if you're getting it for free, you assume that maybe you're not getting the same kind of quality that you would at a 4-year institution. So how do we make sure we've got it transferred over and everyone's fine with it?